our data carried by our attention as something a little bit more like our behavioral DNA. It's a DNA of what we consider to be relevant, important, and so on. And so when digital systems are modeling our behavior, they're actually doing something that's quite equivalent to creating digital cloning. We don't allow cloning of human beings. I don't think we ought to allow digital cloning of our behavior patterns. I think it should be taken as seriously as that, but it's really about attention trafficking. And I know Gunther started by saying that part of the program here is to really think about positive responses, solutions to what's going on with attention economies. And I think that's really an admirable thing to do. But for my part, what I'd like to do is to try to get clear about what the possibility space are for positive responses, but getting a little bit clearer about what we're critiquing when we talk about attention economies. So by way of setting the stage, what I want to do is to introduce some very basics of Buddhism, some resources conceptually that I think Buddhism offers us for thinking through these issues. To relate those, secondly, to attention in AI and machine learning systems, talk a little bit about attention mechanisms and how those relate in some interesting ways with the way in which attention is conceived within Buddhist traditions. To then pull back and start to talk about and identify 4 different strata, historical strata, of types of attention economy to help orient us in terms of our way of thinking about the complexity of the issues. Then to introduce a distinction between tools and technologies that I think will give us some critical leverage in being able to distinguish what's going on at the sort of individual level of addiction to online platforms and what they afford us, and talking about the kind of trafficking that's going on, to kind of get that from a personal individual level, talking about relational dynamics. And then end with talking a little bit more specifically about what's going on with the digital attention economy today and what it's really threatening in terms of basic human rights. And that's another angle on this issue, is a trafficking issue is a human rights issue. So Buddhism, as I understand it, is formulated on the basis of key insight, and that is that everything arises interdependently. And that's been interpreted in many different ways, but I think most strongly interpreted, what that means is that there are no individually existing things in the world. Everything arises relationally. That relational dynamics are more basic than things related, and that each thing is what it means for all other things. The second key insight on a Buddhist perspective is that we've actually got 2 kinds of temporal and causal dynamics at play. One is a kind of a sequential dynamics and temporal dynamics and causality. That's what's often studied on science. You're trying to figure out what's the causal links between X, Y, and Z. And it's one of the reasons why we have difficulty talking about digital attention economies and the way in which they're affecting populations, because what we end up with is correlations that are network-like as opposed to linear causations. Buddhism alerts us to the limitations of that way of looking at causality and suggests we need to look at another type of causality, requiring perhaps another type of temporality. And that's not looking at sequential relations, but looking at significant relations that play out over time in complex recursive sort of ways. That what we experience is the kinds of relationships that we're undergoing, the relational outcomes and opportunities that we have is a diffractive product of those 2 different kinds of causation and temporality, the mixing of sequence and significance. So our karma is the product of our consistently enacting particular values and intentions, and that describes the kinds of experiences that we're having that arise constantly with that. That attention, intention, and action put together don't just act in an environment, but they elicit the environments that we inhabit. I think that those 2 insights, that everything arises interdependently and that there's something that we might call in a Buddhist sense karmic causation, give us some interesting leverage in thinking about these kinds of issues, because what it suggests is that there's no ultimate distinction between the ontological, the axiological, and the ethical. That the divisions that we normally would put between those in a, say, typical Western philosophical context, that they don't obtain in this kind of world that Buddhism is trying to describe. The ontological, the ethical, and the axiological are of a piece with one another. That suggests that we rethink consciousness. And this will become important later when we start to look at the effects of digital attention economies and the importance of data and data extraction. But I think that the Buddhist understanding of consciousness is a relational, non-dualistic one. I don't want to go into a lot of detail about that here. But it is to say that consciousness doesn't arise as a function of being caused by a material substrate. Consciousness consists in the differentiation of sensed and sensing presences. So visual consciousness is the elaboration of visual relations. Auditory consciousness is the elaboration of auditory relations. Cognitive consciousness, the elaboration of cognitive relations. So it's a way of sort of pulling back and saying consciousness needs to be understood in relational terms, and that the brain, body, environment system that in Western philosophical traditions is often the basis of sort of physicalist, reductionist theorizing about consciousness, that is not the cause of consciousness. The brain, body, environment system is infrastructure of consciousness. So in much the same way that transportation infrastructures are the result of transportation practices that then have a constraining impact on future transportation practices. You could go offline, you can walk off grid, but that actually takes effort. Under normal circumstances, most people will follow what the infrastructure says you can do. So in the same way, our body mind systems have an infrastructure, both material and immaterial, that influences what we are doing consciously, affecting our karma, the karma that we're making, and therefore the environments that we find ourselves in, and the kinds of relational opportunities that we have. So from a standpoint of AI and machine learning, attention is a memory process. It establishes weighted connections among multiple inputs over time. So it's a process allowing machine learning systems to go from only attending to kind of nearby sequences, so input from nearby patterns, to looking at, say, the beginning of a conversation, the end of a conversation, and being able to go back through the entire conversation and look for significance relations within the entire conversation. So attention mechanisms have a lot to do with the memory and being able to remember across a sequence of time what's been going on in order to identify what's significant. It's a huge difference between that and a machine learning system that's only looking at near adjacent phenomena and trying to decide, given this one statistically, what word would follow after that. What word is likely to follow after the third word? What word would most likely follow after the fourth one? That kind of sequencing doesn't give you any understanding of the significance of what's going on. To understand significance relations, you need memory. It's interesting that in Buddhism, attention training is a huge part of Buddhist practice, and the most basic form of that, satipatthana, has at the beginning of that term sati or smriti in Sanskrit, a term that's often translated as mindful. It actually means memory, to remember, that is to reattach things, to maintain connections over time. So what mindfulness practice is doing is not so much just being openly aware of what's going on, but being openly aware over time to be able to see the sequences of events that are playing out, and eventually to engage in the insight meditative practices or the concentration meditative practices that are oriented toward understanding what the causes and conditions behind the conflict, the trouble, and the suffering that we experience are. That requires long-term memory to be able to see those significant relations. So part of what meditation practice is doing is getting us to pay sustained enough attention over time for us to begin to see those significance patterns emerging, begin to see how in the present moment karmic connections are being made and being made manifest. It's interesting then that with attention economies, as we normally talk about it today, attention seems to be a single generic thing. Attention maybe is understood quantitatively, how much time people spend on a thing, and I think that's important. But Buddhism suggests that attention is also qualitatively distinguished. There's yoniso and ayoniso manasikara. Yoniso manasikara, the term yoniso means going back to the womb or matrix of things. It's having a kind of attention that penetrates to the causal origins of what's going on. Ayoniso means not penetrating to those origins. It means having attention that's simply attracted or distracted in an immediate way, often by the most craving-inducing aspects of our situation. So ayoniso manasikara is one type of attention. Yoniso is another. Yoniso manasikara takes effort to achieve, effort and sustained practice. And part of what we're seeing with digital attention economies is that it's not promoting that kind of sustained practice. It's actually promoting our reduction to the qualitatively lesser ayoniso manifestation. We're not understanding what why we like the things we like, why we're attracted to the things that were being shown online. That's being done behind the scenes by the algorithms. We simply follow link to link to link to link. So it's part of what was being talked about earlier by Mr. Silovas about a kind of an addictive relationship, an addiction to simply having our attention drawn away from us, entertained, pulled away. So I think that Buddhism offers us a way of talking about attention that allows a qualitative distinction being brought in and not just a quantitative one. So keeping these distinctions in mind, I think it's possible then to start thinking about attention economies in plural and to consider what's going on with the attraction and exploitation of attention. And I think that, we often think about attention economies as being something that only came about with digital 24/7 connectivity. And I think that's really mistaken. Attention economies are throughout the sentient realm. Every sentient being, from a simple single cell organism up to human beings, is part of a biological attention economy. If you look at what's going on morphologically with creatures, you have a difference between male and females within the creatures. You have differences in plants that adapt to attract certain types of insects that will then spread pollen to other plants and kind of perpetuate themselves. That's an attention economy. It's a way of morphologically changing how we're present to manipulate or change the relations that we have with other parts of our environment. And I think we need to recognize that is a type of attention economy that continues. It continues to be manifest. The second type of attention economies began emerging maybe 75,000 years ago with the onset of human cultural evolution. In addition to the sort of biological evolution of attention and economies of attention, roughly 75,000 years ago, something new happens. And that's the emergence of consciousnesses that are freed from the phenomenal present. That part of what language does, part of what cultures do, is allow us to pay attention to things that are significant, that are not present. It's being able to move from what's present and significant, so attention that is only focused on what's present and significant, to be able to see what is absent as also significant. Either something that's absent because it's in the past and we want to reclaim it, or something that is not yet, that we can anticipate, that we don't yet have, but that is currently phenomenally absent. That opens up a new space for attention economies. So what you find with wearing sweaters like this that have colors on them. Normally in Hawaii, we don't dress like this. We've just got t-shirts on or something. If I get hot, I'll take this off. But wearing coats, wearing ties, wearing makeup, jewelry, these are all attention economy items. They're manifestations of an attempt to attract attention for the purposes that are maybe culturally specified, maybe specified in terms of hosting rituals, religious rituals, political rituals that capture human attention and then direct it. So everything from monumental architecture to uses of music, drumming to coordinate people's conduct and behavior is a separate kind of attention economy. Let's call that type 1 attention economy, sort of a socio-cultural attention economy. In roughly the 19th century, as Jim Wu has kind of documented in his book, Attention Merchants, another very distinct type of attention economy starts to emerge, and we can call that whether a monetary or a capitalist attention economy. This is the emergence of mass advertising, where you take print media that includes photographs and so on. It starts with print, later goes on to broadcast media. Begins with print media, where what you're doing is you're attracting attention of consumers and converting that directly into revenue by having a consumer's attention be framed in such a way that it creates a desire or a need for mass-produced goods and services. So that's in its second type of attention economies, a capitalist or monetized one. With 24/7 digital connectivity, another type of attention economy starts to emerge. It's one that's not based on mass-produced advertising to attract mass interest and direct population level, maybe with very highly detailed granular information about this population, but still it's mass advertising. With digital attention economies, it becomes possible to highly target each and every one of us as individuals. So to be able to take our own online activity, to be able to take our attention as a carrier of digital data, where data is not a simple knowledge point about us, it's a record of, a measurable record of what we consider important enough to give our time and attention to, that carries our human intelligence. So what's going on with these attention economies today, with the digital algorithmic capturing of attention and the exploitation of that attention, is what I would really refer to as attention trafficking. It's taking who we are, modeling that algorithmically, and then feeding it back to encourage us to behave in ways commercially or politically viable. What's interesting about this is that in the digital attention economy, unlike the type 2 attention economy, this type 3 has a really interesting relationship between consumers and producers, because each and every one of us, as we engage the online world, engage in these platforms that were being talked about earlier, these platforms that have been designed to be addictive. As we engage in them, we're doing two things. We're acting as consumers, individually targeted informational material, goods and services, and at the same time, producers of the training data that allows machine learning systems to innovatively figure out how to capture and hold and direct more and more of our attention. So we are both producers and consumers. But there's a sense in which what's distinct about this type of attention economy is the sort of collapse of the distinction between producers and consumers, between supply and demand. It's as if it takes supply and demand and turns those two processes like on two sides of a strip of paper. You flip it into a Mobius strip, and now you only have one side and one edge. So supply and demand are a single phenomenon going on all the time. Every moment of demand is a moment of supply. Everything that we do online is supply of data for these systems to be able to interact with us more accurately. So at every moment of consumption, we are also a supplier of data, of ourselves, a record of ourselves and what we consider important. And I think taking that into account is really interesting, because it allows us to see that we are no longer separate from the system, this digital infrastructure. We talk a lot in AI ethics circles about the importance of having humans in the loop. That's often talked about in military contexts, where with military AI, they say it's really important to have a human in the loop so the machine is not making autonomous decisions about who to kill or who to target. But in fact, we are so much in the loop that we can't exit. We are not in a position to get out of the machine learning system. And to understand why that's the case, I think it's important to create a distinction between tools and technologies. Tools are localizable artifacts like books or smartphones or something really big like an electricity grid. Tools are manufactured for the purpose of extending human capabilities in ways that are anticipated up front. They're designed to do certain kinds of things. Tools can be evaluated in terms of their task-specific utility. With tools, we have exit rights. We can decide not to use a smartphone. We can decide not to use a watch or a clock to keep time. Technologies are different. Technologies are relational media. They're non-localizable patterns of both material and immaterial practices that scale up human values and intentions. We do not build technologies. We don't use technologies. We participate in technologies. Technology, the relationship between we as humans and our technologies is like the relationship between species and their ecosystems. Ecosystems emerge out of species into relationships, but then in turn constrain those species relationships. We're in an interdependent relationship with our technologies. Our relationship with technology is not extrinsic and contingent, it is intrinsic and constitutive. What that means is that technologies cannot be evaluated in terms of their task-specific utility, and that the risks of technology are not just the risks of accidents by design, that's a badly designed tool, or misuse by design, where I take a hammer and use it to commit a crime. Those are tool risks. Technological risks are the risks that emerge relationally as the human values and intentions that inform the emergence of these texts are scaled up to the point where perhaps ironically they reach a point of having a feedback loop, where our behaviors are increasingly being recursively informed and intensified by it. In karmic terms, what technologies are is they're karmic accelerators. They take our values, our intentions, and our actions, and they create feedback loops to get us to go into more of those same actions. We do not have significant exit rights from technologies. So when somebody says, I don't want to be a part of the digital world, I don't want to be connected, I can buy out of it. Yes, you can. But if you're a young person and you're not on social media, you're losing out on a lot of friendship. It's maybe not the same thing as committing sort of a social suicide by not being online, but for many young people, it's very, very close to that. Maybe it's something like social amputation, where you lose part of your connected possibilities with others, because we are not just existing in the technological world. That technological world is constitutive of who we are as persons in communities with others. So we need to worry specifically about those values and patterns of intentionality that are being woven into our day-to-day lives through these technologies. So one way of assessing the risks of these type 3 attention economies goes back to what was being talked about earlier in terms of digital addiction, just how much time capital is being invested in digital connectivity. If the global average, when I did the numbers, they were only 6 hours a day. We just heard quoted 7 hours a day of social media and platform use. 6 hours a day. Let's just say it's not all 8 billion people on the planet. Let's just say it's only 6 billion, because you've got a billion that are too old and a billion that are too young. If it's only 6 billion people, that is every day 40 billion hours of human attention energy. If you track that out at just $5 an hour of what people's time is worth, that is $73 trillion a year in a global economy that is now recognized as being about 130 trillion a year. It is 68% of the value of the total normally measured global economy. That is a lot of lost attention capital that could have been invested in something else, because every one of those hours that's spent, regardless of the content, the hours that are spent in media consumption, whether it's a silly cat video or it's something, a 10-minute video on quantum physics, what you're not doing while you're watching that is taking care of your family, or taking care of your neighbors, or learning a new skill, learning a new language, perfecting an ability to play a musical instrument. These are things that have lasting values when we invest our attention. Having our attention go screen by screen by screen through TikTok videos is not productive of yoniso manasikara, this sort of penetrating to the core of things and being able to understand, I'm feeling uncomfortable, I'm anxious, I'm depressed, what are the causes of that? The type of attention addiction that we talked about earlier is productive of a yoniso manasikara, an incapacity for being able to attend to our own circumstances with the sustained and acute manner that is needed to heighten the relational resolution to the point that we could begin to understand how we would address the problems that we're facing. So I think attention and sort of measuring it in terms of capital is one thing, but there's much more that's going on with this. As I sort of alluded to earlier, we often think of data as something like a resource that's maybe scarce. In fact, data is not scarce. Data is absolutely abundant, and more of it is being created all the time. Every given year, we are producing double the amount of data that was resident the year before. There is no shortage of data. But data is not like oil, a depletable resource. Data is not like water, a kind of reusable resource that maybe you can pollute beyond the point of reclamation, maybe not. Data is not matter. And metaphors that suggest that data is matter mislead us in how we think about it critically. Data is a measurement of potential significance. And the data sphere is a sphere of relational commons, of potential significances, a set of potential connections. When you take the data sphere and you enclose dimensions of it, it's just like the enclosure movements in early modern times. You enclose the commons, you allow only certain people access to it. This is a rights issue. When Google or Facebook or the Chinese government says, only we determine who uses this data, has access to it, an enclosure movement within what should have been a relational commons, a public good used for the global public good. That's not the system under which we're operating. So that's one set of worries about it. But at a deeper level, like I said, our data is not just information about us. Our data doesn't represent us digitally. Our data replicates us digitally. It's like our DNA and having that reproduced. If we don't want somebody taking our real physical DNA and using that to clone us, we should not be very comfortable about people taking our digital DNA and having people have access to that deployment. We could talk about what some strategies technologically might be for addressing that, but we really need to be concerned about it. We need to be concerned because attention is not just a proxy for time investment. It is this process of gathering intelligence about each and every one of us and figuring out how it is that we can determine what to give you in response to search and recommendation requests. That is, in other words, telling us what matters most, what we should pay most attention to. As we invest ourselves in these systems, the dangers are that the better as the algorithmic systems become, the more and more human intelligence and computational intelligences are synthesized through the sort of Markov blanket of the data sphere. Human and machine autonomies are being integrated with one another. And the danger that we risk is that we give up, forfeit our most basic sentient right, that is our right to freedom of attention, and the right to cultivate freedom of intention. Without freedom of attention, there cannot be freedom of intention. Without freedom of intention, we cannot engage in the hard work of ethics, figuring out how to live better societies with one another. We run the risk of engaging in technological processes to the point that we produce the conditions for an ethical singularity, a point at which human values become of infinite value, and yet we've got these karmic circulatory machines that feed back to each and every one of us precisely what is most readily able to capture our attention. And unfortunately, for most of us, that's not a particularly good thing. AI and the digital infrastructure are holding up a mirror to humanity. That's all it's doing. These digital systems do not at this point have their own intentions. They do not have their own values. Values, purposes, objective functions are programmed in by humans. And what we are seeing day by day is simply a reflection of humanity. And that should be really frightening. We thought maybe we were beyond the possibility of a European war. Sorry, we've got one. We maybe hoped that we had turned a corner in the Middle East and that you'd never have anything going on like what's going on in Gaza today. We thought maybe we were so enlightened that we don't have any more domestic violence, that sexual violence is not a part of our societies, that the abuse of children, the readiness to traffic and our own children's attention is not something that we would permit because as parents, we'd rather allow our kids to take care of themselves rather than us having to engage in the hard work of keeping them entertained by playing with them, understanding their minds, and being able to relate with them that way. If these systems are simply feeding that back to us, I think we ought to be worried. Now, there are people who are the more the techno optimists, and they might say, but look, you could design different objective functions. You could design a machine learning system that will promote compassionate conduct. Yes, you can. But that's like a eugenics program. We're not talking about biological eugenics. We're talking about attentional genetics, eugenics. We're trying to figure out what should we engineer human beings to pay attention to and how. And like with any eugenics project, that's really scary. The Nazis had a nice eugenics project. They had eugenics projects in the US at the same time in the 1930s for all the good reasons. We want to make a better humanity. The question is whose humanity? Whose values? I don't think digital eugenics is something we ought to take lightly, this re-engineering of humanity. So where does that leave us? I think that what we want to do is to be really cautious of the fact that the digital systems are doing to us every day, very much like what people do when they take physical electrodes and stick them into a subject's brain. You take an electron, you stimulate a part of the physical neural infrastructure of the human consciousness, and you can get a hand movement. And you ask that person, why did you do what you did? And the person will invent a reason. I wanted to scratch. I wanted to interrupt and raise a question. Why? Because there's nothing in the evolutionary history of humankind that could have suggested any other reason for a hand going on. Our neural infrastructure has never been directly manipulated in that way until people started to do open cranial surgery. Computational electrodes are being inserted into the shared infrastructure of human consciousness and are having the same exact input. The choices we make online, the things we decide we want to buy, the music we decide that we really loved and was just perfectly suited to us, we chose to do it. But in a world where these digital systems are capable of not just predicting, but producing patterns of thought, belief, fear, behavior, and the rest, difference between freedom to choose and compulsion to choose collapses. That I think we need to worry about, because we're at the point of giving up the true depth of our own freedom, and that is the freedom to create futures of our own choosing. Thanks.
Okay. I think there is food for thought. Are there any questions? What?